This is The Space Shot, episode 181 for November 11th, 2017. Gemini 12, and my conversation with Jim Remar. Hey everyone, welcome to The Space Shot, your daily space history, pop culture, and news fix. I'm John Molnix. Apologies for not getting yesterday's episode out yesterday. I spent way more time at the airport than I thought I would be doing, and for the life of me, I could not find a quiet place to record the episode before my flight left. Being stuck in an airplane for hours that's jam-packed with tired little kids coming home from Disneyland isn't exactly an ideal recording location either. At least my delay wasn't as irritating as the scrub for the launch this morning of the latest Cygnus ISS resupply spacecraft. A small plane violated the airspace around Wallops Island, causing a scrub in the moments before liftoff. For everyone that got up early for that launch, and for the teams that worked overnight, that's one heck of a bummer. For today's episode, I spoke with Jim Remar from the Cosmosphere about Gemini 12, and he shared his thoughts about that mission. And he also shared his thoughts about some of our veteran astronauts, since today is Veterans Day here in the United States. We had to cut the interview short a bit because of a bad connection on my end, but it's still a great conversation, and I'm happy to share it here. Today I'm talking with Jim Remar. I am sitting outside of the Griffith Observatory here in California, and we're going to be talking a little bit about Gemini 12, which was the last manned Gemini flight. Jim, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Great to be back.
So for everybody that listens to the Cosmosphere podcast, you've probably heard Jim before. We've interviewed him a couple times for that podcast, so it's good to have you here. We're going to talk a little bit about Gemini 12 today. That would be, we've got Gemini 12 there in the or Gemini 10 in the Cosmosphere. My apologies there.
Right.
What was different between those two flights?
The primary difference was the docking, rendezvous and docking with the Agena, and then the EVA that Buzz Aldrin undertook. Up to that point, EVAs had been fairly problematic just because of the unknown and not knowing how to work in that environment. And so Buzz undertook some of the new testing and really was the one who paved the way to work in that environment, and so performed a near flawless EVA during that mission.
Yeah, that's good that you mentioned that, because that really had been a problem up until Gemini 12. I believe it was Gene Cernan who had issues just getting to the back of the spacecraft because they didn't even have like handrails or any of the things that are just taken for granted nowadays. Those weren't even developed back then.
Right. When Ed White and even Alexei Leonov prior to that did theirs, they just literally were floating out in that weightless environment. When Gene Cernan undertook an incredibly aggressive EVA on his Gemini 9 mission, he nearly lost his life. That's how rigorous, hard working in that environment was.
So in Gemini 12, it was Buzz Aldrin and then Jim Lovell. NASA, they would have the practice of typically flying a veteran astronaut with a rookie astronaut. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of crazy to think that Buzz Aldrin was the rookie astronaut in this instance.
Right. Well, Buzz was the rookie, but obviously knowledgeable astronaut and one who had worked on the rendezvous and docking procedures as well as the EVA training. So well prepared for that mission.
Earlier, you had mentioned the Agena target vehicle. Earlier this week, we were able to see one of the target vehicles that the Cosmosphere has in storage. And, it was something I always imagined to be a little bit bigger until I saw it in person. And it just was kind of a shocking moment for me, I guess, just because I always assumed it was a little bit bigger than it actually is. Can you tell me a little bit about the Agena?
Sure. Well, the Agena was a launch vehicle, and the objective was to get the upper stage into low Earth orbit. that would be the target vehicle then that the Gemini would need to rendezvous and dock with. And uh, those two procedures were incredibly important to perfect for a successful mission to the moon. Without a rendezvous and dock, um, the mission would not have happened. And so Gemini really paved the way for those lunar missions, and it was that Agena target vehicle that allowed the astronauts to perfect those maneuvers. And so the Gemini would find the Agena and then maneuver towards it, and then ultimately there would be a docking collar on that upper stage of that Agena that the nose of the Gemini spacecraft would then insert into that docking collar.
And the Agena didn't always work as it was supposed to.
No, unfortunately, it would malfunction. It malfunctioned on a couple of occasions. One, when the adapter, the shroud that was covering the docking collar, failed to fully remove and almost looked like an angry alligator floating out there in space. And then the other was Neil Armstrong's flight on Gemini 8, where a thruster on the Agena malfunctioned and started spinning the spacecraft. Fortunately, as those astronauts were cool under pressure, in part because of their training as fighter pilots or experimental pilots, Armstrong was able to correct that and get out of that spin. But the Agenas unfortunately didn't always cooperate.
So, Jim, let's talk about how did the Agena function on Gemini 12? It sounds like it went pretty swimmingly.
It did. Fortunately for that mission, the Agena did function well, and Buzz was even able to do an EVA out to the Agena. So that mission was as close to a textbook as you could get.
They crammed a lot into the 3 days.
They did. They did. Being that it was the last mission of the Gemini program, they had the astronauts, the crew, conduct numerous experiments and a lot of activity into a short window in an effort to get in all the training they needed prior to the lunar missions.
And it sounds like they accomplished all of the objectives that they needed to.
Gemini was an incredibly successful mission as a whole, and really was the mission that allowed the U.S. to surpass the Soviets in the space race and ultimately get to the moon.
Yeah, I mean it kind of gets overshadowed by Apollo, but there's a lot of technologies that were developed during that program that we wouldn't have had Apollo if it wasn't for Gemini. So it's good that they were able to close out the program so strong. One other thing I want to just ask you about, tomorrow is Veterans Day here in the U.S., and there's a lot of astronauts that are veterans. The current commander of the International Space Station, Randy Bresnik, he's a colonel, I believe, in the Marine Corps. And then going back to the original Mercury 7, they were pretty much all military test pilots up until the shuttle program. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think at least early on and even to this day, the military provided incredible training for those who ultimately became astronauts, and especially in the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo days. Almost all of those astronauts, the early astronauts, were either fighter pilots or test pilots, and it was that attitude and mentality that helped them become the astronauts that paved the way to the lunar landings. Their training allowed them to have a confidence that was needed, a cool demeanor under pressure that was definitely needed, and a can-do attitude, and really a lack of fear. And all of that combined allowed the former military aviators and pilots to be some of the best and the brightest astronauts. And without their experience in the military, they probably wouldn't have had the success that they did as an astronaut.
I couldn't agree more. Jim, thanks for coming on the podcast. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. My pleasure as always.
I'm looking forward to future discussions with people at the Cosmosphere here on The Space Shot. If you'd like to know more about the Cosmosphere, check out the podcast that I produce for them. I've also got more interviews with people in the space community coming up, but between traveling and meshing schedules for the people that I'm going to be interviewing, it's been a little bit difficult to get those nailed down for an exact interview date. I'm grateful to everyone that has joined me on this journey. Tomorrow is the halfway point for producing and recording a daily podcast, and it's hard to believe I'm at this point. Between the podcast here and the Cosmosphere podcast, I keep myself pretty busy, and it's one of those things that I really don't even consider it work. It's something that I enjoy doing every day and look forward to doing each morning when I wake up. So it's hard to think of this as work when it's something that I enjoy doing so much. So thank you all for joining me here. In addition to working on the podcasts, I'm also writing a presentation that I'll be giving at the Cosmosphere next April, and I'll be posting more about that in the coming months. Since you're here, why don't you let me know what you think of the podcast by leaving a review in iTunes? It takes just a minute to do that, and it makes a huge difference because it helps even more people find the show. As always, the show notes have more information on today's episode. You can hit me up on Instagram and Twitter. Find me at John Molnix. I'm always up to chat. You can also connect with me on Facebook. Just search The Space Shot or click one of the links in the show notes. Tomorrow, Voyager 1 and a Titan flyby. I'm John Molnix, and I'll catch you on the flip side.